Hello, everyone, and welcome to our April 360 presentation. I'm Curator of Education Anna Smith, and today it's my pleasure to introduce artist Bettina Pousttchi. Let me begin by saying that I have never been so excited to tell people that I work in a drive-thru. If you've already been upstairs, I'm sure you too were delighted to discover how Bettina Pousttchi has transformed our gallery space into a drive-thru museum, complete with city street lanes and shop gates, recontextualizing both her own sculpture and works from our collection in a radically altered environment. A German-Iranian artist, Pousttchi studied fine arts and film theory at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf and at the Whitney Museum in New York. Over the past 10 years, she has worked with a wide variety of media: sculpture, photography, video, always dealing with social and political issues. In recent projects, including Echo at the Temporary Kunsthalle in Berlin and Framework at the Schön Kunsthalle Frankfurt, she has presented photography at the scale of architecture, lending it a sense of monumentality and presence normally associated with large-scale sculpture. Since 1997, she has participated in group and solo exhibitions, including the Venice Biennale in 2003, the Museum Domus Artium of Salamanca in 2007, and the Tent Center of Visual Arts in Rotterdam in 2009. Joining Pousttchi on stage will be our chief curator, Jed Morse, who has been with the Nasher since our opening in 2003 and who has worked closely with the artist throughout the execution of Drive-thru Museum. I'm sure you're all looking forward to a conversational tour of our guest of honor's work, so please join me now in giving a warm welcome to Bettina Pousttchi and Jed Morse.
It's wonderful to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming to help us celebrate the opening of what is one of the most striking Sightings installations we have had to date. If you haven't been upstairs, this is what you're missing. What Bettina has done has, like a lot of our Sightings installations, artists often decide to create works of art in conversation with the architecture. And Bettina's work has taken the architecture of the Nasher Sculpture Center and turned it into a sculpture of its own. Oftentimes, Bettina's work is about the history of a site and the construction of that history, and at the same time, the construction of memory. And in this way, Bettina took on the history of the site of the Nasher Sculpture Center, but it's an interesting process that you go through in order to come up with the works of art that are site-specific commissions. Tell us a little bit about that process in general, but also here at the Nasher.
Working with photography on the scale of architecture is only possible if someone gives you a building to work with. So first of all, I would like to thank you and the Nasher Sculpture Center for inviting me to let me work with their fantastic building. It's been wonderful. And the process of it is that, very often the work starts with a place, a location, a building. So research is really crucial to the process. I came here twice before the installation to discover, the Nasher Sculpture Center, its building, its location, its history, the neighborhood, the city of Dallas, and that special part of the United States. So it was research on all kinds of scales. And many observations and experiences have led to develop this installation. One of it was, of course, the architecture. And another one was its location. I found out that the place where now the Nasher stands was previously a parking lot. And the road adjacent to it, Ross Avenue, was called Automobile Row because there were gas stations, used car dealerships, and service stations. And I also found out that many people don't know about it, although it's maybe 10, 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And you have this incredible Dallas Arts District now with its outstanding architecture. And to imagine that before it was, a rather, special area was, fascinating.
And cars, of course, we had talked about this a lot. Cars and really, no pun intended here, drove the growth of the city to a large extent. And you were interested in this idea of the car being so integral to to the development of the city itself.
Yeah, it was clear that Dallas is a city that was built to be experienced by car. But coming from Berlin, of course, my first approach arriving here was, something I would always do in a European city, like if I arrive in Paris or something. Let's have a walk through the city. Yeah. And I did that and realized very quickly that doesn't get me very far. I've discovered your so-called car culture, and what comes with it is this fantastic phenomenon of the drive-thru. And so we together researched the drive-thrus here in Dallas. I've been to a drive-thru bar, drive-thru restaurant, drive-thru bank, the drive-thru CVS pharmacy. And I continued my research online and found out there's even more. There are drive-thru funeral homes, drive-thru libraries, and in Vegas, a drive-thru wedding chapel. Yeah. So right. I thought, why not having a drive-thru museum? The museum is almost one of the very few places in Dallas where you have to walk. So I think that was the starting point. Yeah. And of course, a certain interest in the museum as an institution and a reflection on how it changes and in what direction does it go? I mean, what are museums these days? It's sort of the parameters of an artist's work, because it's very often where it's shown. And it's interesting to observe that museums are no longer just a place to look at art and appreciate art and admire art, but they also transform. They offer more and more different experiences and services. Here in the Nasher, I think you can get married and you can, have, host your private events, etc. So I think there should be this service of a drive-thru.
Well, and it's interesting. What it does is it seems to me is that it draws a bright line under the fallacy that the museum is a white cube. It's a neutral site, which really it never is. I mean, it is a specific architectural context that has its own kinds of cultural and aesthetic suggestions. I mean, the travertine stone walls, beautiful wood floors. I mean, it's a lovely place for sculpture, but at the same time, it is a very particular context. And it seems to me that in so drastically transforming that context into a very different one, you've really drawn a bright line under this notion that a museum is a context kind of free of meaning.
Well, you've invited me to show my own sculpture, yeah, but also to work with the collection. And I thought about that. And very often when artists are invited to work with a collection, it's about choice. Yeah. It's about picking certain artworks. And I wanted to have a different approach. I wanted to transform the spatial experience of the collection as well and the function of the museum. So I think this was the base of my approach.
Yeah, and even as we were installing, having these curved lines running through the gallery is something that is completely new. I mean, it's revolutionary for our galleries, which are so rectilinear and you almost, I mean, having worked in the galleries for a long time, if you put something at an angle to the grid of the gallery, it doesn't feel right. And this is the first time that we've ever shown a work of art at an angle to that grid, because we have these new lines of reference. And so it's actually shown a completely different way of installing in that space. We had a really fun time on your research trips, driving around. I remember we astonished one of the drive-thrus that we went through a Starbucks drive-thru, and Bettina was taking photographs, and they wondered what she was doing, and she explained that, you know, she's an artist from Germany, and she's doing research on drive-thrus, and she told them that they don't have drive-thrus in Germany. And this was completely astonishing to the people working at the Starbucks drive-thru.
They're like calling their colleague, "Hey Rick, have you heard that? They don't have any drive-thrus in Germany."
So even then, this very, you know, rich cultural exchange was beginning.
Yeah.
But then, you know, you were the pattern on the windows was. Something that was, you were looking for something that would be an equivalent of kind of like our architectural vernacular, something that people would recognize, but that you could change and adapt.
Well, there were two sort of thoughts that led to this pattern. One was that the drive-thru museum, I wanted to make a drive-thru museum that is temporarily closed. You know, I don't have to explain why. So I wanted to find something that indicates temporary closure. At the same time, right from the start, when you invited me to, you know, react to the space or have an idea for it, I was really fascinated by these huge glass windows that are, you know, making your facade. So I very early sort of mentioned that I would love to do a work on of the glass facades, and, you know, developing the idea of the drive-thru museum, I thought it should be something that indicates temporary closure. So I was, you know, looking for that reference, and we were driving through Dallas, and I was photographing gates and all kind of things, and all of a sudden I thought, well, maybe it's these scissor gates. I knew them from having lived in New York, that very often in shops and other services, you know, at night you close them. It's this sort of metal structure that opens and closes, and I thought they might be the right thing. So we were driving through Dallas, and I was taking lots of pictures of scissor gates. And these were the base sort of reference pictures of the pattern that I developed, and that are now photographic prints on transparent foil glued to the windows.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of gates, and some, I mean, incredibly decorative, and then, you know, I took you around to various houses that had mid-century, you know, brise soleil constructions, and so this was the initial research, but then this is the pattern that you ended up with. Walk us through a little bit about adapting the research into what eventually became to be the pattern on the windows.
Well, this is not the first sort of facade pattern that I have developed. I realized a project 2 years ago in Frankfurt, and that was the first time where I took photographs and then transformed them in a way that they became a pattern that had multiple sort of references, maybe.
Yeah.
It was in Frankfurt, where I photographed half-timber houses that were adjunct to the Kunsthalle where the project would happen. Schönkunsthalle, and there the situation was that they were tearing down contemporary or modern buildings, concrete buildings, in order to reconstruct on the very site that you see here, where the ruins are, a neighborhood of medieval houses, but of course not built in the old way. As you can see, half-timbering is a construction method with wooden beams and clay in between, but they wanted to rebuild or reconstruct these houses with concrete and steel, which is bizarre, but it's kind of a trend in Europe to do these reconstructions. And this work for Schön was a reflection on that, the urban development. And I photographed there these half-timber patterns and rearranged them in a way that recalls the half timber structure as well as something else, something maybe, Oriental ornament. So I really like this idea to having a transnational pattern, because also this half timber houses, and the reason why they're constructed is that I think it's very German and a very German history. Although it's European, they're in Switzerland, they're in Belgium. There's nothing very so German about it, and I'm really doubtful of this construction and nationality that is popping up there.
Right, the way that nationality is often constructed off of.
Yeah, and why do we need in the 21st century a very German historical center? I mean, our society has changed, and I mean, whose history is reconstructed there?
Yeah, yeah. And so when you first presented me the pattern, showed me the design for the pattern, we quickly recognized its relation to the scissor gates that we saw, and to some of the kind of mid-century modern brise soleil structures. But sorry, I'm going to run back to this. You actually told me that you ended up borrowing from the half timbering pattern from your hometown in Mainz.
Yes, I photographed them as well. As Mainz is very close to Frankfurt, and this kind of historical houses, they exist there at Mainz, a small town where I grew up. Yes, so the pattern for Dallas is actually a mix between these sort of European Middle Age patterns combined with this American tradition of the scissor gate.
Yeah.
And I like that, this transnational sort of language.
Yeah. I should have asked the question before I wrote the essay.
Never too late.
One of the other, we were talking about it a little bit before, but this opportunity to select works from a collection and install them, is also an aspect of the Drive-thru museum. So you're not just creating the context or the envelope for it, but you're also populating the museum. And I wonder what was that like what was your kind of thought process in terms of determining which objects would go into the museum and selecting from the Nasher collection?
First of all, it was thrilling. To have the possibility to choose from this collection was at the same time just wonderful. At the same time, it was extremely hard, because how to select between masterpiece and fantastic work and fantastic work. It's not an easy collection to choose from. So I didn't have like one very clear reason or criteria of selection. There were many sort of reasons that came together. One of it was, I picked the works that I love. And others were works what I thought would fit formally or conceptually in the installation. Of course, the John Chamberlain is there for very obvious reasons. And
one of the conceptual choices.
Rather. But it was important that in the end it would really make sort of an entity, an installation, but at the same time respecting the artwork in themselves. I didn't want to sort of use them as my material, but be respectful of other artists' work, and at the same time creating something that would, work, make sense. And,
Yeah, there was, it's a beautiful installation, and one of the great joys of working with artists and having them do works in our galleries is you get to see the galleries very differently, and then having them work with the collection, you get to make connections in the collection that you might not have made otherwise. And so, there seems to be an aesthetic consideration to the way that it's laid out in terms of a balance of figurative and abstract.
Yeah, and I have to mention at first it was not planned that my work is also in the exhibition. It was supposed to be on the terrace.
No, that was my fault. I kind of insisted that we include, where is it? There it is. Yeah, that we include one of the double monuments. because you had selected the Pevsner and the stores, and the double monument resonated so much with both of those, as well as other works in the collection. I thought it would be. So yeah, I threw you into the mix. So you talked a little bit about, I'm sorry, the commission at the Schöne Kunsthalle in Frankfurt, and the way that you had considered the historical context of the museum and the creation of this particular pattern as well. I think, was it your first opportunity of a commission that would consider the context of a particular site? I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Was Echo the first opportunity to do that?
This project was the first where I ever had the possibility to work on that scale with photography and bring it together with architecture and sculpture.
Yeah. So was this a competition? Is that right? That you?
It was a competition.
Yeah.
Yes. In the fall of 2008, I was invited to make a proposal for a facade of this building. I mean, this black and white box that you see there was a temporary art institution that plywood architecture. And the idea of the architect was to not only build a structure that would show works inside of the building, but also on the outside shell. So the idea was, from the beginning, to have 3 projects on the outside facade of this temporary structure. And the first project was this blue and white painting that you see, and then they wanted to make a photographic intervention. So they called me and other artists to make a proposal, and I was invited to do it. So my approach to it was at that time also to make something site-specific, something that relates to the place, because what you have to know is where it stands. It's a very, very historically layered point in Berlin. It's on Schlossplatz, place of the Schloss, the castle, palace, in the very heart of Berlin, on the Museum Island. Next to it is the cathedral, and the TV tower, which of course came after the castle, and our town hall, and all the Museum Island, all the big museums are left to it. And on that very site, there was, in the old days, a castle where the King of Prussia had its sort of headquarters, and then this was destroyed in the war, and it was a ruin after the war. And when the GDR came into place, they've built the Palace of the Republic there. It was a building, there was their parliament building, but at the same time, very innovatively, it was also an entertainment center for the population of the country. And that building, of course, lost its purpose after the fall of the wall, because the GDR no longer existed, their parliament didn't need a site. But it was this incredible, huge building that stood there, and for a while it wasn't clear what was going to happen with it. And artists took over, cultural events happened there, and there was, different plans for it. Unfortunately, one of the plans was to destroy it. And after a long public debate, this is what happened. And that very moment when I was invited to do the proposal, it was in the process of being demolished and almost gone. So my idea was to make something that resonates this urban development. And what you see here is this black and white structure is an interpretation of that building that was just gone right behind it, where the green lawn is. So it became kind of an after image of this building that has gone.
Yeah, and it was an extraordinary building. It was built, I think, finished in the early 1970s, and it was very kind of spare, rectilinear architecture, but this brilliant golden mirrored glass facade. And so just so you have a sense of what the original building looked like and how different it is from what Bettina did to kind of resurrect it, which was a really extraordinary effort. When we see some of it in these images here. So how you printed, you had to break up this kind of photographic remembrance of the building into how many different posters?
970 different photographic prints on paper poster were forming that one motif. So we started, as you see, in the left corner, and put the posters there, and
then continued all the way around the entire building.
4 sides. Yeah.
So it was how many square meters ultimately? That was
1,800 square meters.
Yeah, that's almost. I can't even do the math. 48,000 square feet, something like that. I'm terrible at those conversions. That's why I have that program on my phone to do it for me. And then after, one of the interesting aspects of this was that this is clearly not a faithful reproduction of the Palais de la République. It's an interpretation. It seems like it's almost a memory of it. But it was you took many photographs of it while it was up on view and got to hear people's reactions to it, which I found really interesting. This kind of sense of the people's reactions indicating a sense that memory is constructed in a way, because you included this detail of the clock, which that wasn't part of the old East German Parliament.
Well, I had to adapt this this building to building up had a very different architecture. It was much smaller. It was much more rectangular than the original, and but I still wanted it to be sort of recognized. So I analyzed all the structural elements that formed its sort of memory or form, and there were several aspects that were important. I mean, this grid was very visible and important, and the beams, but also that there was something round there, which at the time was, of course, the emblem of the GDR or their coat of arms. Mm-hmm. But of course, no, in today's times, I didn't want to put up the GDR coat of arms there anymore. So I thought, what to do? There has to be a round thing. And I came up with the idea to make it a clock. And I used the hammer. The coat of arms consisted of hammer and compass, mm-hmm. and I used the hammer to make the arms of the clock. So it was, a certain interpretation, and it connected also to some other project I did. Yeah. And I was surprised to see people's reactions, and there were quite a few people that walked by and said, "Oh, look, how wonderful, the clock is back." Because they had also remembered something round and
Sure.
not exactly what. And it was funny to see people's sort of memories and reactions to it.
This kind of vague recollection of something round being on the facade of the building, and your work actually has probably changed their memory of the Palais de la République.
Yeah, I mean, what people told me that they've experienced people standing in that TV tower, with a round structure up there. There's a restaurant, a turning restaurant like you have here in Dallas, where you can see the city. And someone was explaining to his visiting friends, mm-hmm. "Yeah, look at this," and they were pointing at the echo. "This is the Palace of the Republic." So history was rewritten right there.
Yeah. We were talking about the clock, and so and this other project, which, I mean, I think in terms of its scope, it certainly rivals how impressive Echo was in terms of its scope. The World Time project is something that has spanned, 6 years, 6 continents, hundreds of thousands of air miles traveled. And the clock on the facade of Echo is similar to the world time clocks. Can you tell us a little bit about this project and how it began? And
The World Time Clock is a photographic project that I began in 2008, where I came up with the idea to photograph public clocks in all time zones of the world at the very same time, 5 to 2. But at the beginning, it was a concept that I put in the world, and I had, at that moment, not really the idea what it really meant to my life. But it was also conceived as a long-time project. I really thought of it as a very, very long span where I would just sort of realize it on the go when I'm in certain places. But it had, developed its own dynamic, and it led to a very huge travel project where I would really go to places like Alaska and Vladivostok and Rio de Janeiro to photograph and research and photograph these public clocks. And Echo happened during a moment where I just started with it. So I think I was still in this research on time and time zones and how we structure our geography or temporal experience. So this clock was there, but the project was not public yet. And then in reaction to Echo, I was invited by Art Basel to do something for their Art Public project. During the art fair in Basel, they always have a program of public artworks. And this committee has realized or was aware of the fact that this building you see to the left was going to be destroyed because of Herzog and de Meuron building a new building there. Now it's finished, at that time it wasn't. So they've invited me to do an intervention in this program. And what I did is that I mirrored, on the right hand you see the old Messehalle. It has a huge landmark clock, and I mirrored it to the other facade. So again, there was a clock on a public building, and so it all developed from there.
even though this was a public commission, is the Basel clock part of the broader World Clock project, or was that kind of a specific thing that again helped you kind of develop the notion and the idea for it?
Yeah, it was rather that. It was it was in the early stages of the project, and I developed this concept with the help of that.
Yeah. This, I think you took in Seoul, Korea.
Yes,
is that right?
Seoul. It's the old train station of Seoul.
And so, train stations, airports. You've been through many, many of them now. And in fact, am I correct that you started thinking of the project when you were flying frequently back and forth between Berlin and London? Is that right?
There were many starting points for it, but in the first half of 2008, I had a residency in London, and I was going frequently flying between London and Berlin. And of course, one of the things you do when you visit or when you have time in London is you go to Greenwich to visit the zero meridian, and that was quite an experience because it's this line on the ground and this sort of observation house that indicates this very important place, and they welcome you with the words, "Welcome to the center of time and space." So I thought, interesting, I'm at the center of time and space. So I was thinking of that system that we have.
Yeah.
And where is the center of our world today? And is this London?
Yeah.
Is the entire world supposed to still to look up to this one point of reference? So I got interested in the system of time zones and when it was established and how and with what reasons, and it became clear to me that was not only sort of a system, but that many political, economic reasons led to it, and it's much more to me than just a ordering system.
Right.
So I thought it would be interesting to photograph them all at the same time, as if also in a certain reflection on photography, because photography, what is so special about it compared to other artistic mediums, it has this notion or this promise of the moment, this frozen moment. And of course today with digital photography, you can never tell whether it has really happened or has happened like that, but it has still this promise of the moment that fascinated me.
There's there's something interesting in all of these, is that it highlights the kind of a temporal experience of space. If you have the time zones that are dividing up the planet, you're dividing up space by these kind of temporal designations. You told me at one point how many time zones there are in the world, and I've forgotten.
I photographed 24. That was my idea, but there are more, because we have the system of the full time zones, but there were certain countries like India, for example, that sort of had their own or got out of the 1 hour system and have half an hour. And China is an interesting example because they have such a huge country that spans over, I think, 5 or 6 time zones, but they've decided to just have one, which makes life in Western China pretty difficult.
Because they're all on Beijing time.
Yes, they're all on Beijing time. And Russia is also interesting. They are one of the very few countries that have recently changed a lot their time zones. They've rearranged it. So it's definitely a system, a dynamic system that can change.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And this is the Moscow clock, is that right?
This is Kremlin Tower in Moscow.
We were talking a little bit about this and the experience of going to all of these places, and you had mentioned that you were really, I think it was the trip to Vladivostok. You said you were really glad you were able to make that trip when you did, and this notion that this kind of free movement is something that we're very used to in this day and age, but it wasn't always that way. And then there's the sense now with things happening in Russia that it may not necessarily continue that way as well.
Yeah, it's interesting we really grew up with sort of a very free world, and living in Berlin, it's really in front of your eyes every day that, so many things have happened after the fall of the wall in '89. It's really, this project would have not been possible before the fall of the wall. I wouldn't be able to travel to all these places. And I'm not sure whether it will always be like that. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think we're really experiencing a very special moment, and I was hoping that the wall time clock would also mirror that moment in time. Also with sort of traveling. Travel became so much easier and, economically, more accessible, that I wouldn't have been able to do this 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So, I think it's, although it was 6 years, maybe a project of a moment.
Right, yeah. And then this is New York, of course, Grand Central Station, is that right?
Yeah, I think everybody who's familiar with Hitchcock movies might recognize this clock. Yeah, a good question is, of course, how do I choose them? I get this asked very often, like, wow, why? What is sort of the rule to it? And there's not, much to it. It has to be a public clock. It has to be visible for many people, so that it has a sort of dominant visibility. Yeah. And of course, Big Ben was one of the starting points as probably the most well-recognized or reproduced clock, but also Grand Central Station is one that is very easily recognized. And others aren't. For example, the one in the background is in Bangkok, and it is in the public realm in front of a huge shopping mall. But there are train stations, post offices, courthouses, all that kind of things, always on architecture and not moving. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because all of the photographs have these kinds of striations, and if you go upstairs and you look at the pattern on our windows, even that has these kind of black and white striations running through it, and that's a very specific kind of almost anti-photographic reference in a way.
I'm not sure if it's anti-photographic, but it's definitely something that I put in sort of the post-production process. Yeah, I like it.
You know, it's interesting because it gives a sense of that it's not. I guess I meant maybe anti-photographic is too strong, but it gives a sense of the kind of that photography doesn't necessarily have to be a reflection of reality entirely, and that it can be artifice as well.
Well, I think with this striations, it is a reflection on the reality that we have today, which is not only a one-to-one encounter, but also like a encounter through media. And I always, you know, I'm a little bit hesitant of this sort of illusion world that a photograph is opening up. And I think, you know, photography has all these different layers. You know, it's a medium of sort of illusion, but also of documentation and of other things. And I hope that, you know, this way to treat it will resonate in all these layers.
Yeah. One of the other predominant aspects of the Drive-thru museum are your sculptures. And your sculptures are made from common objects that people would see around the streets in Berlin. Like these bollard sculptures. This is Walter and Oscar and Conrad.
Yeah, maybe I should explain that these names come from street names of Berlin. So it's Konradstraße and Oskarstraße, and so this is.
It's appropriate that the last name of a street bollard would be street.
But you don't have to say it. You can cut it.
Yeah. You know, you've been working with these elements that you know people would find in the street, and taking them, bending them, twisting them, transforming them, putting them together in really dynamic compositions that, at least for me, sometimes are anthropomorphic in the way that they are reminiscent of our personal interactions as people. You know, I think when I met you, I told you that Conrad reminded me of, you know, three friends kind of coming out of the pub late at night and, you know.
Yeah, they drink too much.
Kind of using each other to help them to help themselves stand up. But this this particular piece, Resistant Polar, the first time that you used?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, and it seems like it was intentionally installed here as an impediment, at least in the gallery space. You have part of a photographic series called Takeoff shown in this gallery at the same time. Or am I misinterpreting?
No, but what's fascinating about this Resistant Polar was that it was still not transformed. It was sort of the real street bollard, and the only thing I've changed was the surface, which was mirrored or chromed. And so it reflected the surrounding space. Mm-hmm. But the fascinating aspect of it was that very often when I asked people, so, hey, what do you think about the sculpture? They were like, which sculpture? Because they didn't see it. Because we are so used to see the street bollards everywhere that you erase them from your perception. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they were leaning on it like, which sculpture are you talking about? That was really fascinating. So I got interested in this aspect that we are surrounded by objects that really influence the way we move through space. Mm-hmm. And we're so used to having them in our way that we are no longer aware of it. So I got really interested in working with all these street objects, crowd barriers, street bollards.
You know, and these are, you know, the street bollards, the crowd barriers. These are objects that we encounter every day, and particularly in urban environments. But they also have, you know, specific, you know, they have connotations of control, whether it's keeping cars off of sidewalks or keeping people out of certain areas. And in earlier photographic series, this kind of element of surveillance and control is something that seems to permeate a lot of them, where the striations, the black and white striations, which it sometimes evoke memory in works like Starkerstadt and Takeoff. They evoke surveillance, kind of low-resolution surveillance photography. I wonder, this was something that you seem to be doing something very different with these objects now. They're not specifically objects of control.
Well, the striations are not just, I think they can recall different things. I mean, of course, the low-resolution surveillance cameras, but at the same time also early newspaper photography or the attempt to photograph an image from TV. So all kinds of different media approaches, and sort of it's a mix of all of these things that I find fascinating. And with the crowd barriers and street bollards, I mean, they're objects that structure our space, and this I find interesting. They are, in a way, the public space is kind of structured in a way we no longer think about it, but the way we move through space is totally a reaction to it, and it's very unconscious. And this is also why I really like these curves, to put these curves in the space, although they're not even objects, they're just a drawing or a painting
in the Drive-thru
on the
museum.
floor. They will change the way you move through the space. And that's really fascinating, I think. And it's exciting here. The Drive-thru Museum is really a new step in the facade project, because it's no longer just a facade. It's in sculptural photographic installations. Because one of the very first things I thought when you invited me to come and look at the space was that I thought, oh, interesting, there's a museum and an architecture that was built just to show sculpture. And that's very unique, I think. And you can see it in many, many decisions, how consequently it was followed. So one of my first thoughts was, oh, let's transform this building into a sculpture. And this is what came out.
A couple of the other works in the exhibition are your double monuments to Flavin and Tatlin. And they're made of crowd barriers that have been twisted and then combined in these kind of towering compositions and then powder coated in this kind of brilliant white. And they have these shafts of neon running through them. But these are also about, to a certain extent, about memory as well, memory and time, and how we pass on information.
Yeah, they're kind of a double homage. They're an homage to someone who made an homage to someone else, an artist. The artist Dan Flavin made this homage to Vladimir Tatlin and his, never realized project of the Tower to the Third International. And I find it interesting to see how knowledge sort of survives time and how memory sort of lives on. And one of very interesting ways is through homages of artists to other artists. So I wanted to make this double homage, this double monument to Flavin and Tatlin. And I used these crowd barriers, which at the time I started using, and bent them in a way that they recalled this concept of Tatlin. At the same time, having a Flavin element in it, which was the fluorescent light. So yeah.
One of the interesting things about the double monuments to me is that they are there's something so essentially sculptural about them, which I know sounds kind of redundant or silly to say because they're sculptures, but they're these kind of large and oftentimes very kind of complex compositionally, but still transparent forms. They remind me not only of same kind of complex, transparent sculptural forms like Gabo's linear constructions, or here, even though it's not necessarily transparent, his brother Antoine Pevsner's dynamic projection at 30 degrees, the sense of twisting and turning and kind of a linear form being turned into a volumetric form. But it also reminds me of something that would be formally completely unrelated, like Henry Moore and his internal-external forms, because you do get the sense of a carapace, an exterior, with usually a really kind of intricate and complex interior form. Sorry. Nope. So I was monologuing there for a minute. Is that kind of very specific sculptural aesthetic concern? I mean, when you're making these things, that has to come up in terms of some are more complex, some are more open, some are more closed. I mean, what is it like trying to make these things? Because you're working in a factory with someone who has a machine that isn't usually used to kind of crush and bend crowd barriers.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest parts in this project was actually to find a workshop that would allow me to put crowd barriers in their machine. It was quite difficult, and I found a workshop in the very outskirts of Berlin that were ready to go for it. And it's a very, very old machine, so not much harm can be made. And they were, this lovely couple who was ready to go. And it's a very slow process and very mechanical. It does one band after the other, and I have a preconception of the form, but at the same time, it's always a process of reaction to the material's own dynamic. Yeah. And they've, have their development, and some are higher, some are not that high. I mean, the one you see here in the foreground, which is the one on the terrace outside, is probably the highest I ever made. But it was also an experience of the process and how to make them. I come with this very straight crowd barrier in the workshop, and I do one bend after the other, and it's really a challenge, like how narrow you can make them. Yeah. So the new ones, like the other one in the inside room, not that one, but later they became much more narrow. Yeah. But it's a learning process for me as well, how to work that material. And once those single crowd barriers are made, I stack them and decide the form in the workshop. Mm-hmm. And then from the other side, the welder comes and I tell them where to weld it. And then they leave the workshop in one object and get powder coated. Yeah.
Is it, this is must be an interesting dynamic. I mean, you said that the workshop where you do this, they're not used to using the machines to bend crowd barriers in that way, and they're also probably not used to working with artists, much less female artists. It seems it's a kind of
it's very bizarre.
It's very
bizarre, and they're suspicious, and they're observing me, and they're like, "What is she doing?" It was difficult in the beginning. But there was a moment when the first objects were finished and they were standing there. I mean, they couldn't stop but laugh, Right. They have no knowledge about art there. I mean, of course, they're there's metal workers, and but what I like is that they had an approach to it even though they didn't have big knowledge about art. They looked at it and they found it funny, and they were making jokes like, ha ha ha, is this like 1st of May in Berlin? It's our big day of protest, yeah. Where sometimes the barriers in the street end up in similar form. Right. So yeah, finally I think I can work there without too much trouble.
Yeah. They see things a little differently after doing a number.
They don't see the reference to Tetlin, but at least I can do my job.
Yeah. Let's see, where are we? So I have included in here kind of the evolution of the crowd barrier in your work. This was an early video installation where you called Line, where you use the crowd barriers in this very kind of literal but sculptural way within the space of the gallery.
Yeah, just completely closed the space. So it was a space that was filled from corner to corner entirely with a very narrow sort of stack of crowd barriers like they are on the street. I have not transformed them at all. So the spectator was not able to enter the room, but had to stand outside. He was excluded of the space to look at this video from outside. And this is a video line, and it has it shows also a street line.
Yeah, it's essentially this kind of procession of people, and the line is a very distinct formal element, but also essentially becomes a kind of psychological barrier itself in terms of people walking on either side of the line. Is that right? Not crossing it? People crossing it?
No, they don't cross it. They really, although there's no reason for it, they work completely parallel to it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It has a connection to upstairs. It's true, because it's something on the street that it's not in their way, but you become respectful of it. Crossing a line is always a step.
Yeah. And then this was another video installation called Landing that you did, I think almost a year or two after Line, where now that's becoming a kind of a sculptural element. So you've built this construction. Tell us a little bit about how the sculptural element works in conjunction with the video.
I think this was the first installation that you can walk around, so it became more of a sort of traditional sculpture. Mm-hmm. So really my approach to sculpture developed from the installation, from a three-dimensional spatial thinking. And first there were videos in it, and later they became video installations without videos, which you may call sculpture. And that was one of the first sort of independently standing structures. And from there, I started bending the crowd barriers to a series that were called Blackout, mm-hmm. which was also an exploration of space and form. And later, they became these towers. Yeah.
So I wanted to conclude our conversation with essentially the next project. And this is a rendering that you created for a project that grew out of your receipt of the very prestigious prize, the Wolfsburg Prize. So tell us a little bit about this commission and what you have to look forward to when you go back.
It's a medieval castle in the town of Wolfsburg, which hosts 2 museums. And I was invited to make an exhibition inside for this award, and also asked to do an outside facade project. And what you see is a rendering of a photographic installation that covers 3 sides of this castle, with a photographic print of about 20,000 square feet, which covers a scaffolding. And it's very high, like 3 times higher than the Berlin project. And it's also a reaction to the town of Wolfsburg, which is, a planned city of the early 20th century. And I was really interested of, this idea of, nation and architecture and the icon of modernity in architecture, which is the high-rise, the skyscraper. And what you see is it's a photo montage of all buildings who have been, in their time, the highest building of the world. And here they become sort of one building. You see, the Singer Building, which was demolished in 1968, mm-hmm. the Empire State Building, the Woolworth Building, Willis Tower from Chicago is around the corner, to like Petronas Towers, and the current highest building of the world, which is the Burj Khalifa.
Yeah.
And no longer will be, because now the Saudis are planning a tower that is almost as double high as that one, with the Kingdom Tower, which is supposed to be finished in 2017-18.
Oh my God.
And what's fascinating about this highest building of the world competition between these nations is there's not much national about it. I mean, they're all like built by the same architects, planned by the same engineers, paid for by the same sort of global money streams.
Right.
So the question is, what is national about that?
Right, the supposedly national distinction of having the tallest building in the world is, yeah. And so, so is all of this it covers the scaffolding for the restoration of the castle, and it opens.
On May 24th, so
May
if you by any chance come to Wolfsburg, please come by.
Well, Bettina, thank you so much for changing our perceptions about the Nasher Sculpture Center and the collection and bringing your incredible installation to Dallas.
Thank you for the invitation and for coming.
If you all have any questions, we're happy to entertain a couple, and then we can continue the conversation outside. Yes, sir.
I certainly picked up on a sense of whimsy upstairs, and I wondered if, after touring around Dallas, if you want to push that a little farther and actually put in a drive-in window with a digital menu board.
Great idea.
Yeah. Today, I would like to see the Brancusi, with a side of Giacometti's.
I'm curious, the idea to me of a drive-through is that, like where I'm sitting right now, maybe I'd be a couple of inches higher if I was in the car. So if I was driving through the gallery where there are pedestals, that would be higher than I'd be able to see. You know, if you're in a convertible, you have a lot more the ability to see all around you. But if you have a car with a window that's, 18 inches high, that's all you can see. Did you consider doing things on a high level for actually being in a car at all?
Well, I had thought about this question, how to experience this from a car. And one of the decisions I took was there's nothing that is standing on the ground. We had one sculpture that we then took out. So they are all on a pedestal. But of course, I didn't want to make it higher because, obviously it's a temporary closed drive-thru museum. So no, also for the placement of the sculptures, it was really considered how you would look through the window of a car and have a certain perspective. And I think that was also a discussion that we had because Jed was not used to having this perspective. Usually, the sculptures are installed in the perspective of the sort of middle row of the gallery,
right,
and not of the sort of transparent float of photo space.
Yeah. There was a funny story when we were kind of putting the sculptures, just starting the installation. You may have noticed if you've been upstairs that the Matisse large reclining nude is facing the window. And Jeremy asked, does that go there? Are you going to reorient that? And we said, well, no, it's from the perspective of someone driving in from the terrace, and the point of address is to the imaginary person coming through the drive-thru. So, yes, sir.
I think we have a project for her, the building next door.
Yeah.
But including that would solve all the problems.
It would make
She's here, she might as well do it.
It would make a great work of art as well. Yes.
I have a question about the World Time Project and why you used 5 minutes to 2, and I imagine all the clocks running along, so I was more interested in just why you picked that particular moment.
There is no reason for it. I'm afraid to say it has to be the same moment, and it was a choice had to be made, and it was that time. Of course, I somehow like it that it's 5 minutes to something, so there's a moment of tension, but there's no real symbolic meaning to it.
Maybe the first clock you did, that's the time it said.
Maybe.
Well, thank you all for coming out today.
Thank you.
We can continue with a glass of wine out in the lobby.